Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you waiting and for your patience. Oh, there we go. As David had mentioned, this research is a community and collaborative endeavor, and it's thanks to these organizations. Edmonton Arts Council, David, your leadership is integral to bringing this to organizations across the province. So thank you to each one of these for making it happen. This is a community resource, and we want everybody to be able to use it. If you know other leaders in your sector who could take advantage of the data or could find usefulness in it, please share it. We'll have a link at the end as well, and in the chat at any time. So again, thank you very much to each of these organizations for helping. Now, as David had mentioned, this research is a longitudinal study, and what that means is we go back to the same Albertans over 6 different phases of work. This is the results that we're sharing is from the 5th phase of work. I'll show you when. It's across the province. Our sampling is just over 1,346 surveys, or exactly 1,346 surveys. And that means we've got about 80% of that sample is returning wave over wave. So we're able to start seeing how attitudes and perceptions are changing and how people are being affected by the conditions that we're going through. All of the sampling is balanced for age and gender, and then we weight all the final results to match census profiling. All that means is, at the end of the day, the sampling, the people that we're including in our research look exactly like the population of Alberta. So we know it's accurate that way. All of the data that we're going to share with you today was collected from March 5th to 22nd. You'll note that the irony of that is that last time we presented results that we collected at the height of case numbers, and as case numbers were going down, and now we're presenting results that we collected when case numbers are at their lowest, and now case numbers are back up. It's important to keep that in mind because the context in which we're doing the research are really, really critical. No research exists in a vacuum. And all of those external things are impacting how people are thinking and how they're feeling. And we've timed our research very deliberately to capture that. So you can see by the gray boxes when we've done different phases of work. And the December phase, for example, we're capturing when case numbers were very high, and in March when they were very low. So now we have an understanding of what happens when things change. This is going to be absolutely critical, as you're about to see, because that's going to impact everything from comfort level to emotional state. The one thing that we didn't include here, but we do always want you to keep in mind, is that there are economic variables that we're watching too. And the economic conditions, as we learned very early in this pandemic, are equally important in Alberta because they're unique to Alberta. We sustained an energy price crash in March of 2020. That's resulted in an economic restructuring that still continues. And while energy prices are back up, we're still seeing the impacts on unemployment and wage. So those are things that we're all going to have to think about and continue to think about as we look at how people are reacting to the pandemic. So with that, let's start with comfort. As you know, if you've attended before, comfort is a new variable that anyone in the experience economy, but particularly leaders who are trying to engage audiences on site, we have to deal with this. It used to be just awareness and cost and subject matter we have to worry about, but now we have to worry about how comfortable the audience. And what we're seeing is that comfort is shifting in direct step with the conditions around us. In March, when this was fielded, we saw case numbers drop to basically end the second wave of the pandemic. And as a result, we see comfort levels go up. In Edmonton, 24% of Edmontonians said that they're highly comfortable in large groups. It's lower than what we see for the rest of the province. About 30% on average fall in this category across the province. Edmontonians tend to be less comfortable than other parts of the province. There's still a smaller number, again, in the low comfort who are only with their small groups, but that's down significantly when case numbers were at their highest at 47%. Now we're looking at a bit of a duality. So we've always seen a mix in the middle where we have about half the population sits at that medium comfort with my social group. And there's slight polarization starting to happen where we see fewer and fewer in the middle and more on either no comfort or very high comfort. This is something we're gonna have to watch as a community. What it's telling us is that even as case numbers go down after a wave, that it's gonna take a while for comfort to rebound, even though case numbers and restrictions are easing. And part of that trend is highlighted when we compare and align case numbers with that, and I'll show you. So the red bar reflects the trend in case numbers since the beginning of the pandemic. And we just updated it before this because we're at 20,986 active cases in Alberta right now. And the blue line reflects the average comfort rating that Edmontonians and Albertans have been giving across the pandemic. And early in the pandemic, most fell into that comfortable with my own social group category, about half, 55%. But when case numbers skyrocketed in December, you can see the average comfort level drop significantly. And then when case numbers dropped, comfort returned. If you wanted to project, you could probably safely predict where comfort is going to go now that case numbers are very high. Now, it's not just case numbers that are going to impact it. Contrary to popular belief, Albertans are rule followers, so it's natural that they want to follow the rules, but not going to be comfortable in large groups because that's simply not allowed right now. So as we see these conditions change, we're going to see comfort change. And the one variable that we're going to be adding to the mix now is vaccinations, because now we have wider access to vaccination. So we're going to be watching that in May into June to see what happens to comfort levels and be able to provide, hopefully, some better sense of what to expect later in the summer. Now, comfort is not going to be the same across the province. As I mentioned, Edmonton has the lowest proportion of people who are highly comfortable in large groups at 24%. That pales in comparison to Northern Alberta, where 44% say they're comfortable with large groups and basically back to normal. And the important thing here is that there isn't necessarily some kind of philosophical frustration or difference. There's two things that are probably impacting it. One is the case numbers in Northern Alberta, for the most part, have been dramatically lower than other parts of the province. The other part of it is that the economic impact from the crash in oil prices has been acutely felt in Northern Alberta. So we recognized early on that economic circumstances were impacting people's desire to get back to normal and comfort. So when economic impacts are stronger, people have a stronger desire to go back to normal and get back to doing things as fast as they can. In central Alberta and southern Alberta, much lower than northern Alberta, but slightly higher than Edmonton, and then about the same as Calgary, about a third of the population. So Edmontonians are a little bit more wary, and they're going to take a little bit longer to rebound, likely. As emotions are changing, risk-taking is a little bit more steady, which is important for us to watch. And as we look at comfort level fluctuate more greatly, we are seeing that the proportions of Edmontonians who are high risk takers is up slightly, but not dramatically. And Edmonton is interesting in that it stands out for nearly half as many risk takers in Edmonton at 16% than there are in Northern Alberta at 33%. Edmonton also has the highest number of risk avoiders. So for those of you who don't remember, early in the phases of research, we profiled Albertans by their propensity to take risks, their capacity for risks, and their willingness to weigh experiences over risk. And this helps us profile them. This is helpful for us for getting people to understand, okay, I know my population might be risk reducers, so willing to take some, but I want activities, but we still need to watch their comfort. Okay, so over the long term, these trends are going to be important because they're going to help us identify when we can start to expect audiences to come back. Their attitudes are equally important in Edmonton. The high acceptance of restrictions, 75% consistent with December, even when case numbers are going down and restrictions are coming off, that people are saying, you know what, they're just part of my life here. Again, this is seems like it's a bit of anomalous to what we see in the media because the vast majority of the population are following the rules and are comfortable with them. The proportions who think it's blown out of proportion, now this isn't, again, a philosophical or a denier sentimentality. It's actually pretty consistent with what we're seeing in national research too. And what this means is that Albertans are particularly looking at other things. Economic variables in particular are taking a priority for many, and for at least 40% across Alberta, 35% in Edmonton. And it's not to say they don't see COVID as a concern. Obviously, we see where comfort levels are at, but again, they're weighing the dual challenges of the economic restructuring that we're experiencing and the pandemic at the same time. So let's recap for a second. There is a pattern to comfort and risk, and we know that now. We were often asked at the beginning, what's going to happen? Well, we can't predict exactly what's going to happen. We can expect that comfort levels, the mindset is going to set the tone for how we're going to engage for the short term. And you need to take these into account and look at your audiences, and this research should provide that. And if you need to take them into account. And organizations, we've seen in some cases where this has happened, but organizations that overlook how the audience is feeling are not going to be necessarily positioned to respond to them with the right messaging or even the right programming. And it could be as simple as saying, listen, if you know the audience is in an uncomfortable space, that means we have to step up our safety measures even when restrictions come off. That means we need to reassure them. It means we need topics that might be more positive and uplifting. So some things that you can consider doing. First, Tune your communications to align with the mindset. We know that they're uncomfortable. Be sensitive to that. It's not just engagement. It's not going to be just about communications. It's also going to be in your programming. Right now, it's primarily digital, some limited on-site in the future. So we need to make sure you look at that and say, do they encourage or inhibit engagement based on where the market is at? This would not be the time, I would suggest, for very challenging cultural experiences. We want to be able to uplift and show positive experiences and make people feel comfortable and not uncomfortable. So keep those in mind as we do that. Let's talk about vaccines. Never would I have thought, dealing with the experience economy, would I be dealing with vaccines and thinking about this in terms of engagement, but that's where we're at right now. And vaccines are absolutely critical, not just for curbing the trends on pandemic, but in the long term, vaccines are going to be absolutely vital to getting people to re-engage. When we ask Albertans and Edmontonians, what's it going to take for you to be comfortable in public again, 75% say vaccines. And 70% in Edmonton are telling us, I need to see other people vaccinated. So it's going to be important. In fact, wherever possible, we should all be encouraging people to get vaccines, because it's not just about health and safety. It's about this is what it's going to take for most people to come back and do stuff again. Statistics are also going to be important at 69%. So just seeing case numbers drop, hospitalizations drop, we're tuning into those messages from the government. So we're paying attention to it. It's important. When we ask them to isolate of all the things you said, what's most important, most comfortable elements are going to be driven by getting vaccinated themselves. So again, the vaccine. There's a role for us to play in that, because it's not just about health. Remember, this is about helping us all get back to normal. One of the questions we get asked a lot, and we got asked pre this wave, was how many people, what proportion of the population do people need to see vaccinated in order to feel comfortable again? And on average in Edmonton, they need to see about 65% vaccination rate in order to feel comfortable to attend events again. This will vary based on the risk profile. Obviously, risk takers are more eager and ready to go, so they only need to see 24%. Right now, they'd be ready to go back, 100%. The risk avoiders at the other end, people who don't have the capacity or the willingness to take risks, they need to see much higher at 80%. The bulk, that 52 or 53% that fall into the risk reducer category in Edmonton, they need to see about 2/3 of the audience vaccinated. Now, we're a little bit of the ways off from that right now, because right now, just the latest statistics show us about 31%, and that includes both first dose and or completely vaccinated. So we're about 30%. Basically, you could think in Edmonton, we're about halfway there for the vaccination rates before we see enough volume of people vaccinated to get people back into participating and attending. So it's not going to be a matter of just seeing restrictions come off or case numbers drop. They're going to want to see at least certain levels of vaccination across the community. Now, why does this matter? Obviously, it's important. We want to see vaccinations go up for our own health, but from an organizational perspective, this is an important element in your planning, particularly if you have things that may be running, festivals that are going to be running in the summer, or closer to now than maybe later in the fall. And organizations should be watching that progress to help time their planning and their relaunch. Remember, you don't have to start engaging audiences when restrictions lift. You can time them earlier. So that's something that you should be consider doing right now when it comes to vaccination. Incorporate this as one of the metrics in your planning and time your communications accordingly, okay? Because that could be giving the advantage of either capturing the attention of the market or missing an opportunity. Megan.
So now that we've looked at some of those factors that are going to influence comfort levels, I want to shift to what Edmontonians are thinking and actually doing. So one thing that we learned over the course of the past year is a lot of the activities early pandemic, you may be able to anecdotally speak or kind of laugh at this, is that they were really feeling a need. So more of those pandemic trends like the banana bread, the cinnamon buns, the puzzles, they've lost their appeal because what really comes down to is that audiences are done with just filling their time. We have much more clarity on what we like to do and what people are eager to get back to doing. So what does that look like? One of the theories that many that we've heard is that the pandemic is really shifting values and interests in a dramatic way. But what we found is that certainly there's been a forced change in behavior and habits, as Matthew mentioned, being a rule follower. We see that 82% say because of the pandemic and restrictions, my habits have changed. But the reality is that interests have changed at a far slower rate, with only half of Edmontonians, that bottom bar there, that say, because of the pandemic, what I'm interested in doing has changed. And this is slightly greater than the general Albertan population. So there's quite a dramatic difference there. And much of that shift in habits is that rule following the changing. It's mandated, forced by restrictions that our habits have changed. What's that telling us is that when we look at that gap, for some, it's forced the change in behavior and allowed them to discover new things. Like in the second one from the bottom, 51% say one good thing that's coming out of the pandemic is discovering new things to do. But for others, that is likely going to mean just that temporary shift. Until old activities resume, they're going to shift into new activities, but once allowed to do their old activities, they will go back to those. Implications are coming from really what you can do from a programming perspective. So who's going to come back and what do you continue to offer? And of course, we said this before, we've touched on this each phase, but these attitudes are shaped differently. So understanding your audience and kind of where your audience falls is going to help you understand kind of where they're at in terms of attitude and mindset. So those with a higher risk tolerance, as we've seen, haven't shifted their interests as intensely. There's still that more kind of outstanding out there group. They're more hopeful things will normalize again, greater pent up demand, really ready and raring to get back to that pre-pandemic life. On the other hand, risk avoiders, they're more likely to have changed their habits, but also their interests. So this group has likely been able to find something new that's interesting to them and keeping with that once pandemic's done over in the rearview mirror. Regionally, habits are also shifting. We talked about comfort, and then across Edmontonians, they're acting differently, lower risk tolerance, less confident that things will normalize. But on the other hand, they've come to find slightly more new interests that they'll keep going. And of course, the demographic component, in this case, we're seeing females, generally speaking, are more likely to have said that they're prioritizing what's important to them and discovering new interests. So again, this is reminding us that we always need to look at the differences among different types of audiences in respect to their attitudes. Now, just to reiterate on this point of shifting interests, the shift is quite stark. So most Edmontonians, that middle bar there, have at least some new interests, but very few have abandoned old interests completely. So there's still that new and old, just more interest in general. If we look at this from a risk tolerant perspective, risk takers have stronger preference for the things that they used to do. They're ready to get back. They're really holding on to this, but the sentiment is quite a bit more mixed for the rest of Edmonton. Again, a reminder that most Edmontonians, when we ask them to look forward, they're looking into a mix of the old and new activities. So as we know, it's hard to predict the future when we ask these types of questions. There's always a little bit of hesitation. You never really know. It's hard to know. But a lot of what people want to do and are going to do is going to depend on the format and availability, of course. But also key takeaway is that we know Edmontonians will hold on to some of the new things that they've discovered, but they're also eager to go back to what they used to do. So there's a mix, and what this means for your organization is that there's going to need to be that same mix of things that are available to them that will pique their interest. So now, interests aside, it's also really interesting to examine kind of where the priorities are. This really leans towards communication and messaging and really what you can do as an organization to communicate with audiences. On the surface, time spent with family, personal well-being, mental health, they may seem obvious and what you would expect to be at the top of the list. But what we have to keep in mind is that this is part of a broader trend we've been seeing accelerate through the pandemic. There's a lot of studies you might be familiar with that talk about the emergence of wellness, mental and physical, on all of those associated elements. But what's happening is people are prioritizing what's in front of them. So we hear chatter, we all see the news on vaccines, locally, global scale, politics, the whole 9 yards. And they're very much in the news cycle, and you think they might be dominating kind of what people are thinking and how that impacts what they're doing, but it's truly what's in front of them when it comes to push and shove. That these are the global, the news, less pressing issues, and it's what's in front of them that is most important. So again, a reminder that there's some pointed themes here that you can really tap into when it comes to communicating with audiences. So if we were to sum this up in respect to interest, it's going to be a bit of a tug and pull. It matters, but we're going to go back to what we learned right at the beginning of this, which is Edmontonians, along with all Albertans, are experienced pursuers really more than anything, what we had found kind of in that first wave. And as a result to the pandemic, there's been a bigger uptick in self-directed activities. If you remember from earlier phases, we talked about this with respect to kind of what that allows for, self-directed, less commitment, more time flexibility, if they need health restrictions, kind of more of that on their own time. These are likely here to stay in some form, but audiences are also telling us that they want that full experience again. So they want to be room for both when this is all over. So as an organization, what this means is that we need to start thinking of alternative models of programming delivery over the long term. How are you melding what's best of what you're doing now with things that you used to do and get that kind of both experiences for your audience? And if you're developing an experience or a program that's not self-directed, it's more of that full experience, how can you build that experience that's more interactive, differentiated, unique, so it really stands out and gets people to come back? So let's shift now from what people are doing or what they really want to do, their mindset habits, but get into a little bit more of that emotional feeling. So now, after a full year of this, I suppose it's not surprising that the range of emotions is quite different, quite vast, and complex. And it tends to lean negative, again, not surprising, but there's a new question that we added this time around. We really wanted to get a sense straight from their mouths of how they're feeling. So this was open-ended. People typed in exactly how they're feeling right now. And here's what we get. We get the tired, the frustrated, the bored, the anxious. But there's still a whole mix of emotions emerging. There's lonely, there's happy, there's some more of the optimistic and positive emotions showing up. The next layer to this question, so then we presented our kind of typical list that we've been tracking phase over phase in order to capture kind of where these shifts are showing up. And sure, primarily negative on the surface, but we have to remind ourselves that negative emotions are different. They're not all the same and they don't all reflect the same thing. So what we see here is that the frustration, the exhausted, annoyance, impatience that are at the top of the list, yes, they're negative, but they're negative in an active way. They're really clear reactions to being restricted, to have all the rules in place. So they're reflecting a sense of pent-up demand. It's that I really want to get going, and because I can't, these are that type of negative that I'm feeling. And these are much different from more of hostile emotions like anger, or despondent emotion like sad, or even one of the first times we asked emotion, worry, was, and fear was at the top of the list. And you can see here that worry has really dropped since December. So the other thing that's showing up, which you can see identified by some of those little red arrows, is the glimmers of hope and optimism. There's an uptick in these and in gratitude, but it's more of a precarious optimism. It's pent-up demand emotions will likely linger for some time, but these glimmers of hope will show through. And as Matthew mentioned, and we saw kind of with that chart of caseloads when this was in field, these emotions have likely shifted since as case numbers have risen since people were answering this question. And so attitudes are actually enforcing this mindset. So the desire to rediscover is growing, with 82% who say they can't wait to rediscover experiences, activities, events in their community again. But confidence is still not higher, and it's lower in Edmonton compared to Albertans, that things will feel normal again as we approach spring and summer. So again, it's this roller coaster of emotions. There's that tug and pull between really wanting to engage and the pent-up demand, but confidence and comfort in actually doing so and thinking it'll happen. So this is really represents a psychological mindset. It's primarily reflecting the pent-up demand, but it's very complex. It's confused markets. They're really seeing people feeling psychological whiplash is how we're referring to it. There's a confusion on different emotions, but also a pent-up demand, even if it is precarious. So again, understanding that tension between case numbers and wanting to follow rules as more vaccines happen and come through the province, but also the strong desire to get going. It gives you some hints about what you can do next and capitalizing on this. So there's something that we've heard from organizations. They're uncertain on what to do, this kind of feeling of sitting and waiting, but we know that consumer sentiment reflects that pent-up demand, and there has to be a way to capitalize this and continue planning and be ready for when it's safe and there's a thumbs up to do so. People will be ready and are expecting organizations to be ready as well. So it's going to feel unproductive in the moment. It'll be short notice to get going again, but we don't want organizations to fall behind. So when there is the thumbs up to get going, being ready to do so.
Thanks, Megan. Last thing we wanted to talk about today was the whole sense of generating revenues. We got a lot of questions about this. The last few phases of work is, okay, that's great, but how do we think about revenue generation in the current market and within the current context? And I think one of the things that's really critical to note is, just like where the audience has created expectations to be flexible, and we expect the audience to be flexible, there is also a need for flexibility in terms of how revenues are going to be generated. So what does that mean, really? Well, first thing that we asked this time was tested the viability of certain kinds of subscriptions or single ticket purchase buying and what's going to happen. And in Edmonton, participants are much more likely to be preferring a single ticket entry, particularly in the arts and culture and attraction space, than they would be for a membership or subscription. In sports and recreation or personal fitness, it's a bit more of a 50-50. This is different than across the province. Albertans tend to have a slightly higher preference for subscription or memberships in sports and recreation. I think one of the things that's really important is that, and we heard this a lot and saw a lot of questions early in the pandemic about this being a value changing exercise, and it's not. Values don't work that way, but what it has done is hastened a lot of trends that were already in place. And so the audience had trends, expectations for innovation and flexibility early in the pandemic, and those have just been accelerated. And I think what we're seeing towards a preference for single ticket buying is more of that experienced pursuer in mind, and a lot more desire for flexibility. So they're not necessarily willing to commit. It doesn't mean that they're not going to go. It just means they're not necessarily willing to commit for a whole season. Now, it's important to keep in mind that if you're a membership-based organization, that, and we've had this question a lot in the arts and culture space in particular, where organizations were seeing membership decline. That was a trend that was happening before the pandemic. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong with the organization. What it means is the audience is shifting more towards desire for more variety in their experiences. So they're less likely to buy subscriptions and more likely to be trying more single ticket purchases across a more diverse range. So keep this in mind. And we heard this early last phase as well, when we looked at Albertans and say, listen, what's it going to take for you to get involved? What would you need to see or hear? And the first thing they told us at that time is, show me the refund rate, show me the flexibility. So this is consistent with that over the longer term. This doesn't mean, though, that they're not willing to contribute or provide ways of support. When we asked Edmontonians about different options for supporting organizations without the guarantee of an experience, only 45% said, no, I'm not comfortable paying at all, unless I know the experience is going to go ahead. So that's important. So you got just over half who are saying, yes, I'm willing to consider it. But what they're willing to consider also offers a measure of security. So buying cards to use later. So they're willing to invest now, knowing that something later will come, or pay for a service in advance. There's also a significant portion willing to donate at 28%, slightly fewer in discounts. I think at the end of the day, what's really important is organizations should be looking at a diverse range of ways of getting people to invest in experiences that might come later in the year. And this is part of that engagement we were talking about earlier. You can engage now for experiences that might come later. Just recognize that there's going to be about half that aren't necessarily going to be willing to do it, but there's going to be lots who will be saying, listen, I can give you the security, you're going to get something. Will you invest now? Yes, significant portions are saying they will, which is good. When we look to donating, so when we ask among those who are willing to donate, and this is, interestingly, we did some work for across Canada called for the Canadian Online Jazz Festival and found similar findings as well. And yes, there's propensity to donate with about 56%, but there's an interesting element of not being forced to. So there's a difference between asking and making it a condition of participation. At that point, it's actually not a donation. It's actually paying for service. But we still see notable donations at 56% overall. But again, it's not an element of forcing it. One of the takeaways for all this when it comes to finances and investing overall is that there's going to be that need for flexibility. And I think part of this is not just a reflection of economic circumstances, but it's also a reflection of being restricted and being told what they can and can't do for a long time. So over the last year, we've been told there's enough rules around me. I don't want that on top of what I might consider to be a donation or support for an organization. So just as how you consider how you adapt your offerings and the program delivery and the same consideration you put into communications, you're also going to have to think about how we build flexibility into support options. So that's one thing you can think about, or a few things you can think about. One is offer different payment options. Prepayment, gift cards, all that kind of stuff are good because they're flexible, but they also offer an element of security. Donations are certainly going to be an option. It's going to be certainly a payment or a support option for some programs. The key here, and what we're seeing in other work as well that we've done, is that reinforcing the messages of support and what that donation does. This isn't about just giving money to an organization. It's about supporting an artist or supporting the organization for the long term. And then I think finally, the last thing that you're going to consider doing is that there's going to be less demand for subscriptions and season passes. And we don't know what that looks like, but alternative modes of support are going to have to be considered over the longer term. This is no different than what we're seeing with lots of media companies, particularly cable, who are dealing with, how do I deal with all this streaming? What are things that I have to do there? I think if there's going to be an avenue of exploration, it's going to be on those different modes of financial support post-pandemic and what that might look like. So we've done 5 phases of work. What are some big picture things? So 3 things we'd like to leave you with before we start our conversation. First thing is relating to the nature of the crisis. We've all seen different crises at different times. They tend to be much more isolated. They tend to have impact on a small group of people. This is not that. This is the opposite of that. This is a widespread crisis affecting everybody for an extremely long period of time. So how we might have handled it in terms of crisis management is not going to apply anymore. The other thing is because of the length and the breadth of this crisis is that it's influencing widespread consumer behavior. So habits are changing, and they're going to take a while to change back. What people are considering and how they consider it have been altered. Perceptions of risk, which we saw earlier in the pandemic and earlier phases of work, have gone from personal to more community or group oriented. Ultimately, organizations should expect that the headwinds that we're feeling now are going to last for some time. Yes, we're going to see an immediate return on some level, but we're not going to have things go back to normal. That's gone. So there's going to be some headwinds until we get cementing some of the post-pandemic environment and what people are, how they're behaving. The other element of this is the nature of the challenge has made this personal. And Megan was talking about this earlier about priorities changing, and family and wellness, personal health wellness have shooting up to the top. This is not to imply that family wasn't a priority before, or health or wellness weren't priorities before, but they were table stakes before, and they were always meant to be considered and always there, but they weren't an active part of a consumer's decision metrics. Now they are becoming much more important in terms of how people are deciding what they're going to do. They're not just taking it for granted and just expecting that that's going to be met. Those needs or priorities are going to be met. Some organizations have already adapted to this. The great example of this is on the fitness world and the digital engagement is Peloton. Their messages were very deliberately focused on wellness and very flexible in terms of their approach on the digital. Their company is built on that. But not to say that everybody has to be like Peloton, but what Peloton has done is really focus that to be part of their messages. And I think organizations in the arts and culture space in particular have an interesting opportunity to respond to that focus on family, because you bring people together to share experiences on well-being because of the mental and conditional health of it. There's lots of benefits. So again, I think there are opportunities, but recognize that the personal nature is going to be something that we're going to be having to deal with. Last thing is the importance of adaptation. We've talked about this early on, and I mentioned this earlier. The pandemic's biggest outcome in terms of widespread trends is it's acceleration of lots of trends, acceleration of things that were already happening before. Few examples. Flexible work. Flexible work was already a trend happening before the pandemic, and organizations pushed back on it because they weren't necessarily sure about whether or not they could do it. Well, look at it now. It's possible and it's happening, and now the trend is just taking off to the point where we're reevaluating how we do business. In the experience economy space, the trends were already there in terms of expectations of adaptation and innovation. Consumers were no longer saying the biggest barrier for me to engage was cost. They're also saying it's cost and seeing the same old thing. So organizations that gave people the same types of experiences over and over again were more at risk of losing those audiences over the longer term than they were if they innovated and changed the perspective and gave them something different to think and feel about. That still remains. In fact, it's more accelerated, and it's been sort of added on to and changed slightly with the need for flexibility. So we need to build that in, and we need to build the innovation into our ongoing planning. The days of all organizations being able to do the same thing, even though people love it over and over again, are really bygone, because people aren't going to be able to, are willing to pay for it over the longer term. And organizations are going to have to adapt to that and really go start to reevaluate why we're there in the first place. And it's a bit of a Simon Sinek thing, a social thinker and a business thinker on this stuff, but it applies very well to this. Organizations we're advising is to go back to your why, not your why, but also the consumer's why. Why are they there in the first place? We did a session workshop with an organization earlier this week with the same topic, and the end of it, we focused on with all of their employees, their group of employees. There's 9 of them there, not a lot. And we asked them, why are people there? And what became clear right off the bat is they were able to start to identify feature-wise. So they came to see this, or they came to see that. And once they get past that, to say, well, yeah, they came to laugh, they came to be with their children, they came to learn, they came to feel exhilarated, and they started to focus on the benefits. There are opportunities for seeing what they could do differently because they can't offer the same thing anymore, started to open up to them. So it's likely a positive and potentially productive exercise for organizations to go through as you're thinking about, how do I adapt to be more flexible? How do I adapt to be different and still meet what my audience needs? Lastly, and it's not a point of data, is a reminder. This is the beginning of a conversation. For those of you who have attended before, we want to answer questions. We want to have a discourse with you, but in the longer term, we're here to answer other things, other questions you might have outside of this. So if you ever have a question or want to see more data, go to that website, but our contact information is there. Megan and Kim and I are happy to answer questions. If you are struggling with a question, you're thinking, wondering, well, what if or what about? Those are the kinds of things that we're happy to help with, and we're here to answer them. As part of that, and it's a little plug, if you'll allow me, is we're hosting a workshop for subscribers next Wednesday, May 5th. We are going to be sharing many of these results on a province-wide level, the same things, but as part of the workshop, we're going to have a panel of speakers. They're leaders from different organizations in arts and cultures, recreation, and festivals to talk about their experiences planning. So we have Kim Staleman from Citadel, we have Cynthia Watson from Vivo, which is a recreation organization, and Teresa Howland from the Calgary Stampede, a festival in Calgary, to talk about how they've approached planning and how they're looking at relaunch. None of them are going to come and talk about when they're relaunching because they don't know. We don't want to ask them that, puts them on the spot, but we are going to want to learn from them about what they can do and what they've been doing. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back to the group, and hopefully we can have a conversation.
I'm just going to add the link to register for that session next Wednesday if any of you would like to join. So it'll be in the chat.
Oh, yeah, it's perfect. That's great. Thanks, Megan. It's in the chat.
Yep.
Click on that and you can register if you
like. Thank you so much, Matt and Megan. If you have any questions, you can either ask them through the chat or activate your camera and join in.
I don't have a question. Sorry, I just thought we were all going to pop on the screen.
We will absolutely do that at the end. Thank you so much, Michael.
David, were there any surprises for you?
I'm surprised that that there's such a prevalent I want to get back under almost any circumstances. You know, I'm not surprised that it's less prevalent in Edmonton than in the north, as for reasons you've gone into.
Mhm.
I'll go ahead and ask a question if you don't mind.
Yeah, for sure.
So you've got a great sort of picture of the different groups with different attitudes. I know that a lot of our organizations have a very clear demographic sense of who their audiences currently are, and which is not to say that that will be their audience moving forward. But are there any correlations that you could give between the three categories that you describe in terms of risk, the risk averse, the risk takers in the middle, and any other factors, not necessarily a complete mapping, but a correlation?
Yeah, for sure. So there's always going to be links. It's a great question. When you look at the data, it's kind of hard to find your audience in there. The risk tolerances are one of the best ways of looking at it. When we look at risk takers, they tend to be slightly middle-aged and younger, family-oriented, lots of families, young families in particular. They're dispersed throughout the province, but we find a little bit more of them obviously in northern Alberta and in southern Alberta, less so in Edmonton. At the other end of the category are those risk avoiders. And what makes them different, the defining feature for them is a real concern about their own health. And so we also, as a result, correlates well to age. We tend to see a lot older audiences, equal mix of gender, but slightly higher in women than we would do men. And then in the middle is the risk reducers. And they look just like everybody. They're attitudinally different though. These are eager, curious audiences who would like to pursue multiple experiences, where risk takers are heavy into sports and recreation outdoors, and risk avoiders at the other end are very heavy into arts and culture, less in that. The risk reducers do it all, so which is great. And at the end of the day, you can find bits and pieces, but you also said something in your question that was really important to me, David. It's not just about who your audience is now, it's also who your audience is going to be in the future. And I think that's going to be the potential for audiences. If I have a glimmer of hope in all of this, is that because audiences are now looking for new experiences, they're looking to try, they've been a year of experimentation and discovery, we might be able to be ripe for reaching them. And it's not just through our own work, it's through collaborations with other organizations. Remember the overlap between sectors in the experience economy, festivals, arts and sports and travel and all that, and events, is tremendous. There's only maybe 8 to 10% that have exclusive verticals. They're only fans in one category. So what that means is the people who are fans of the Arts and Design Festival are also likely participating in soccer tournaments, or are Edmonton Oilers fans or Edmonton football team fans, right? So there's crossover that might inspire collaboration. And I think that collaboration happens in two ways. One, arts organizations tend to be a lot more sophisticated, and sports organizations can learn from you, but also they have access to fan base that you don't. And so they might be able to cross-pollinate that way. So there's multiple advantages to it. But look deeper in it, and those are one of the questions that we can answer. Hey, this is what my audience looked like. Is there anything more that you can tell me? And we can start to check on that for sure.
Lovely. Christine has asked, do you know how many more updates you'll do?
Yes, so we have one more phase of work in this round of the experience economy. We're exploring experience economy 2.0. What's this look like? We have some things that we're planning on. We're hoping to talk to see if we can make it happen. And what we're thinking about, I'll be totally transparent, is one thing that we're hearing from organizations is, yes, I want more, and other ones that are saying, wow, this is a lot, but I still don't know how I can deal with it because I don't have the resources. So we're considering about trying to understand capacity and need among organizations, and then going back to the public in the summer when things are a bit more normal. That'll probably be key. So we're hoping to be back, but definitely one more in late May or June.
Lovely, thank you. We'll look forward to that. Jill has a question about price elasticity that I would love for her to ask herself if she's comfortable doing so. There are some nuances in there that I don't think I'm fully capturing. So
yes. So we've been talking quite a bit about all the prices of everything going up in the next 6 months, right? The cost of gas, the cost of being able to do all of these things. And so as organizations, we're going to have to absorb those costs probably by passing them on to the consumer. And then with that, there's the questions, like I was kind of starting with that lens on, I was looking at the data moving forward and just curious if there's going to be more work about, are people willing to pay more? Is cost going to be a deciding factor? We've been talking about split in the economy, right? People that have not lost income over the pandemic versus people like me that have, and how that's going to impact choices. So I'm just curious if that lens is something that you guys are thinking of as you're moving forward, and if so, how?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a fundamental one. It's a tough one, Jill. We have explored some of it already in previous phases, and we know that for risk, for any audiences, they'd love to see some discounts because they've had to face economic hardship. I think the best way of looking at it, I'll answer your question in two parts. The first part is what we know right now, and I think the economic impact from the last year is going to be with us for a while, no doubt. Consumers' ability to spend is going to be reduced. So what that means strategically for organizations is expectations on subscription sales, as an example. I would temper those, and I would be putting more emphasis on single ticket sales because it requires a less financial commitment. And that's part of the flexibility that we saw already, right? People, that's part of the reason why they're investing less in subscriptions. That said, we also know that they've been sitting on a lot of money for the last year too. So that doesn't necessarily translate though to willingness to spend more. So I get it. We're caught in that it's a K recovery for not just consumers, but for organizations as well. So it's going to be a balancing act, and I would suggest that organizations are probably be better off with more flexible sales options or commitment levels for consumers. So single ticket or banding together with multiple organizations to sell multi-packs in a really crude way to get their dollars and drive value. But we will exploring. So the second part of your question, or that I'll answer, is that yes, we're going to explore it because action orientated more on the last phase, what people will do and what they will actually spend. But I'll put this caveat on there. Audiences very rarely do exactly what they say they will do. So we always conservatively move everything down, right? But I'd be curious to see what they're willing to spend moving forward. It's going to be a challenge. I think we're going to have to all get creative. It's across the experience economy, right? Oh, one last point I'll add, sorry to belabor it, I get long-winded at times, Jill, sorry, is that one key part of that that's going to be important is not just the cost, but the value equation. The consumer does this. We know this not just from our work here, but from others. Their value equation is not just what things cost, it's also what they're getting out of it. So in a year where they've done inundated with self-directed activities, adding value add or directed experiences that allow them to dive in a bit more might be induce a little bit more spending, if that makes sense. Megan, do you have any thoughts, or does that make sense to you too?
Makes sense. You touched on the flexibility aspect, which is really top of mind for me, being able to pick and choose where you're spending money, and if it's not going to go ahead, being able to get it back or have that choice of what's going to happen with their money.
Does that help, Joe? Awesome.
Great. Unless there's anything else that comes to anyone, I'm going to encourage everyone who's still on with us to turn on your cameras, turn on your microphones. We will take a moment to thank Megan and Matthew directly. And again, to be honest, it's just nice to be able to see you all. I miss you. So yes, anyone who's still with us, if you are comfortable in doing so, please do join us on camera for a bit of a send-off.
Nice to see faces again. I miss this.
Yeah.
Look forward to meeting you all in person sometime.
All right. Well, again, thank you all so much. We will keep in touch and keep you posted on other developments, and we will look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully this summer.
Well, thank you.
All right. Thanks again, everybody. Have a wonderful day.